becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the drumbeat for a potential conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. But at his press conference earlier today, the president tried to maintain a measured response, warning Iran, but also making the point that contrary to what Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum say, there is no rush to war.
When you actually ask them specifically what they would do, it turns out they repeat the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years. If some of these folks think that it's time to launch a war, they should say so. And they should explain to the American people exactly why they would do that and what the consequences would be.
Congressman Peter Welch is a Democrat from Vermont and Chief Deputy Whip, and he's just returned from a trip to the region. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
We've heard Newt Gingrich saying the red light is now on. We've heard Mitt Romney talking about action against Iran. And when one listens to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said to the conference in D.C. yesterday, do you get a sense that the drumbeat for war with Iran is becoming inevitable?
Well, there's enormous pressure in its domestic politics as well as a very serious situation with Iran. I mean, the president's made it clear that it's our policy to not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But the question is, how do you do that? Right now, sanctions are very, very tough. We have support for sanctions with the European Union, with the Arab League. And they demonstrably are having a significant impact. And what's happening are two things. One, there's domestic politics. The presidential candidates on the Republican side are trying to talk tough and out-tough guy everybody and ridicule President Obama for showing appropriate restraint. And then secondly, there's a illusion that the military option, if used, would be definitive, decisive, and declarative, when in fact all of us know that the military solution means that other things will happen and you have to accept the consequences of that and talk about how you deal with them.
Allow me then to show you what Rick Santorum said when asked about President Obama's commitment to Israel. Here's what he said.
I've seen a president who has been reticent. He says he has Israel's back. From everything I've seen from the conduct of this administration, he has turned his back on the people of Israel.
Turned his back on the people of Israel? Did Mr. Santorum suffering hearing failure, perhaps? Because that's not the impression that I got from the president's speech and press conference.
Right, and not at all. And Santorum is pandering for political votes, and he's talking to his very narrow base. And then Romney is doing the same, and so is Gingrich. But bottom line, this is a profoundly important question for Israel, for the Middle East, and for the United States of America. And in fact, it can't be micromanaged by candidates, and it certainly can't be micromanaged by Congress. You know, sanctions have worked in the past. They worked in South Africa. They worked with North Korea, and in fact, they worked with Iraq. I mean, when you see the history of the sanctions and how much it debilitated the weapons of mass destruction program that supposedly Saddam was doing, it shows you that patience is required as much as aggression is sometimes required. So the president, I think, has got it right. All options are on the table, and he reserves the right to use force if that, in his judgment, is required. But what we're hearing are politicians pandering for votes, and the way they're doing it is by escalating the war card. And it's very dangerous and irresponsible in my view.
Isn't it ridiculous of these individuals, though, honestly, to be attacking the president on foreign policy when this president has been aggressive in pursuit of Osama bin Laden, Anwar al-Awlaki? He's used more drone strikes than George Bush. He's not someone who is weak in terms of defending this nation based upon his record. Just look at the facts.
Well, you're right. He's been extremely resolute. He's not been shy to use force when appropriate. And actually, I think that's probably where he's been very, very strong. So, bottom line, Martin, these guys are running for president. They'll do anything, and they'll basically say anything to try to win that narrow base. Now, each time they're doing it, I think they're creating some apprehension among independents, moderates, reasonable people who understand the obvious, and that is, yes, you reserve the right to use force, but that is the decision you make with great caution and sobriety. And in fact, on my trip to the Middle East with Mr. Cantor, when we met with leaders in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, they fully supported the sanctions. They are absolutely against Iran having the weapon, but they had a sober, cautious recognition that the use of force has consequences, and they approach that decision with appropriate caution.
Indeed, and just quoting the President, he said, we need to be careful, thoughtful and sober in our approach. Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dylan is